Hi, I'm Laura Welp, and I work for the Western Watersheds Project, a conservation group that advocates for healthy ecosystems on public land. I'm pleased to be a part of this symposium on such an important topic. So, what is a conservationist perspective, anyway? Well, broadly speaking, the conservation perspective prioritizes the restoration and maintenance of intact, functioning, sustainable ecosystems. Healthy ecosystems are most able to resist disruption when they experience disturbances like floods, fires, or drought or grazing. And if they are impacted, healthy systems are the most resilient and able to recover from disruptions. We believe that the restoration of intact, functioning ecosystems is the best chance we have of keeping the world livable for animals and people now and in the future. So, how is this different from the land management agencies? I took a look at the mission statements of a few of them, and there are some commonalities. The BLM wants to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity for present and future generations. Forest Service, essentially the same. Fish and Wildlife Service, working with others to conserve for the benefit of the American people. And that is right in line with what we're trying to do: restoration of intact, functioning ecosystems for people now and into the future. So it's clear that we all have the same essential aim. We all have similar definitions of what constitutes a healthy ecosystem. Most of the people doing this work have some way to at least qualitatively assess the essential components of landscape health: soils, hydrology, and vegetation. Assessing rangeland health of a site requires a standard of comparison, and that's what ecological site descriptions are. They are developed by government ecologists, and they characterize what can be expected on a site under different disturbance regimes, including no disturbance, and that would be the reference state. So we all have the same general idea of what a site in good condition looks like. Unfortunately, millions of acres don't match their ecological site description or achieve land health standards. The soil's hydrology or vegetation have departed from what should be there, often because of problems with lack of understory or too much bare ground. Here we see the same kind of conditions in a pinyon juniper community. So why do we have these conditions? Well, leading theories include a combination of fire suppression, grazing, or climate change that allows trees and shrubs to expand and limit the understory plants. Agencies respond to this with large-scale treatments over millions of acres to remove the undesirable sagebrush and pinyon and juniper and seed in those missing grasses and forbs. Some areas do show vegetation establishment, at least in the short term. Although here we are also seeing some Russian thistle, and bull thistle has moved in, and soils have a hard time recovering from these kinds of disturbances. We also don't have a lot of empirical data on long-term success. What we do know qualitatively is that lots of older treatments have low rangeland health scores and have to be retreated. For example, here we have a semi-desert loam Wyoming big sagebrush ecological site in reference condition. And it has a diversity of shrubs, grasses, and forbs with Wyoming big sagebrush, ephedra. There is ricegrass and drop seeds, and it serves as a nice comparison for the following slide, which is a treatment that was conducted in the same ecological site. So our functional groups have disappeared and been replaced by annual exotics. And these don't protect the ground as well, and so we can see bare ground and erosion everywhere. So why doesn't this look like the reference ecological site? Well, it's an old seeding for one thing. It's decades old. They probably seeded non-native grasses and not much else, and so we don't have a lot of species diversity, and it's a monoculture. And I know that this site has this allotment has a history of trespass. So when you take those disruptions or those stressors and you add a really bad drought that happened in 2002, we see that this site just didn't have the resilience and the resistance to be able to withstand that drought and come back. It was a bad combination. So there was another treatment put in 2007. And I returned in 2012 to take a look at it. And we see some recovery here in the perennial grasses, but other functional groups like biological soil crust and forbs and shrubs are still missing. And the litter that we see on the ground here is actually from cheatgrass, so that's not ideal. The other issue is that this site was seeded half and half with native and non-native grasses, but more of the grasses that came back are the non-natives, like crested wheatgrass. And the problem with that is that these non-natives can be aggressive and they can actually take over and prevent reestablishment of the native species. And this might be okay if you're only interested in revegetation, but we are interested in restoration of all of the functional groups for more sustainability, and we don't want a monoculture. So take a look at this arrow here. That's going to be a reference point for our next slide. So I visited again 7 years later in 2019, and this is what I saw. And unfortunately, it looks like this second treatment failed, even though it was only 12 years old. So we are not hitting that managing for future generations part of our mission statement. Climate change has made getting this right even more urgent. This quote is from an article that has been getting a lot of attention lately. The authors used tree ring data to show that the first 22 years of this century have been the driest since the year 800, and we may not be done with the drought yet. So what are we going to do? I say let's turn to science-based management. It's time for some new empirical research that leads to innovative new methods. For example, passive restoration should be explored in greater depth. Where there's a locally adapted seed bank, sites could be allowed to recover naturally without human intervention. It takes longer, but it doesn't damage the soil surface like mechanical treatments or prescribed burns. And we might consider changes in livestock management, like using riders to move cattle around or prescribing lower utilization and stocking rates. There are studies showing that lighter grazing leads to healthier grasses and forbs in the understory. We should also implement the science-based policies we already have. For example, we have drought policies recommending that drought-prone areas graze more lightly before drought and allow more rest after drought breaks before resuming grazing. We could follow that direction. And simply adhering to BLM allotment management plans and taking cattle off on time would help, as would following resource management plan direction to manage forest sustainability. Finally, we need to learn from past experience what works and what doesn't, and that's hard to do without data. So we need to develop robust study designs with exclosures followed by consistent monitoring. And we need to identify examples of ecological sites in good condition to serve as references. Here I'd like to give a shout out to the people that installed this exclosure in the seeding we've been looking at. This isn't another part of the allotment. We can see that there is still lots of bare ground, but look at these beautiful native perennial cool season grasses. This exclosure shows the potential for restoration of this functional group, and the exclosures really are invaluable. It's important to stay mindful that science occurs within the context of the larger society. I came across this quote about climate change and changed it a little for this talk. While public lands management requires the input of many disciplines, the drivers of and the solutions to resource challenges are fundamentally social, economic, and political. And it doesn't matter how much data you have if you don't address those issues somehow. The science can help with that. Science-based management means that we have to be objective. That forces us to back up decisions with credible sources, like peer-reviewed published research. And this allows us to focus objectively on solutions rather than getting caught up in unsupported personal perspectives, and we all have them, and cherry-picking only the science or pseudoscience that supports our beliefs. Science also provides us with a common language so we all know we're talking about the same thing. For example, that rangeland health assessment process I mentioned at the beginning was designed in part to teach a wide variety of people how to come together and assess indicators of landscape health. Just having the same point of reference reduces misunderstanding and allows us to focus on solving problems rather than on our differences. A common language also makes addressing hard subjects easier, like the fact that there are lots of livestock on public land, and sometimes they can have a negative effect on ecosystem processes. We don't always acknowledge that, but we can no longer afford to ignore uncomfortable truths. We need to have that conversation. The long-term success of restoration treatments depends in large part on post-treatment management of livestock. That means we need to look at how grazing impacts post-treatment landscape health in the long run, and why so many of these areas need retreating if we're managing for sustainability. To recap, the conservation perspective is that management for healthy, sustainable public lands must be based on science, and our vegetation projects should be aimed at restoration based on ecological site descriptions rather than serial revegetation. Finally, we really are at situation critical here. We need all perspectives to solve resource problems. All voices need an equal seat at the table. The land management agencies are in the driver's seat here, and they can set the tone by sincerely listening with respect, considering alternative viewpoints, and using scientific input. We are in this together, and we need all hands on deck.